Hey guys, Matthew here. In today's video, I want to showcase one of my starter builds for the upcoming 3.16 Scourge League, and that is going to be a General Cry Blade Flurry Berserker. So one thing about this build is that out of all of my league starter builds, this is one that has the highest ceiling, but this is also the one that I would say has the lowest amount of damage on a very small budget. That being said, you could invest very small amounts of currency and get the damage to some pretty ridiculous heights, and then when you start to really pour in a lot of currency, you can get some very, very disgusting damage, as you'll see when I showcase the POB. Alright, so now that we have gone through that, let's talk about the build real quick and the showcase. So what I'm going to be showcasing to start off the video is a Forge of Phoenix with 84% quantity, a little bit of monster damage, poison on hit, whatever, nothing too crazy there. One thing I want to talk about real quickly about this build, however, is that in the current state of the build, it's an extremely squishy build. When the upcoming patch hits, we are actually gaining a lot of survivability on this build through the buffs to armor and the ability to invest into additional maximum resistances, which are both things that are going to boost the survivability up a lot. Especially the armor buff, because physical is by far the biggest problem for this build, because right now Abyss gives us 41% increased physical damage taken, and then after the Carnage another flat 10%, so we end up with taking ridiculous amounts of physical damage. So if you ever sit in some side of slam that is physical based, you can die very easily. With the changes to armor and the big buffs to it, that is no longer going to be as big of an issue with this build. So that's really nice to know. Alright, now let's talk about the gear that I'll be running here. I'm going to be running pretty much as cheap as a setup as you could get. So I'm talking pretty much the only necessary item here is the Red Blade Banner. The Abyssus is really nice. You don't need it, but it's a super cheap item, which you should get either way. So Abyssus with no enchant, Red Blade Banner, and then the rest is just going to be Life and Resistance. Ichimonji, very cheap option until you can buy Paradoxica, which is going to be our endgame option. Life and res, life and res, life and res, life and res. Very important that we get a one non-channeling cost. This is going to make it so General Cry costs a lot less, as well all our other skills. That just kind of makes it a little bit smoother. And then we are also going to need a channeling skills minus mana cost for a Cyclone. Now this right now is probably the most expensive item in the build, in the entire build, despite the fact that it's really bad. All it does is gives me trigger level 8 Assassin's Mark on hits. And the reason why we want that is because this build kind of struggles with getting critical strike chance. We're only rocking somewhere around 50% even as it stands with the budget option. And the reason for that is very simple. Ichimonji has a base critical strike chance of 5%. So it's really hard to scale the actual amount of crit on a budget for this build. Alright, now that we've talked about that, let's head into the showcase and then we're going to hop into the actual POB. So what I'm going to do is a Awakener 7, of course, with Guardian's Aid on the Phoenix. So this is a pretty endgame map, and one that, you know, you should be able to do on this build with a very cheap budget. I mean, in a league start scenario, looking at all my items, the entire thing would probably cost about 2x, because I know that you guys are looking at Raislotha and you're thinking, oh, this is a really expensive item, and to be fair, it pretty much is, but as I'm about to showcase, you don't need it. I decided to take it off for the showcase. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right into the map. So the way that this build works is that it's a cycloning build, so we are just going to General Cry and then Cyclone in order to proc Desecrate and all that good stuff. Now, one thing that you could go with on this build that would drastically help the build would be, both in terms of survivability and just kind of like feels goodness, is a Kitava's Teachings, I believe. Which gives you, or Disciple of Kitava, I don't quite remember the name of the jewel, but the one that gives you 5% recovery of life and mana if you've consumed a corpse or something, which General Cry does. So what that allows you to do essentially is have like permanent sustain on life and mana without really needing to invest into anything else. It's just really nice quality of life. But it's not necessary at all, because that is definitely something that's a little bit more expensive in a league start scenario. But as you can see, the clear is very reasonable, really. Now, we actually got to the boss, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to weapon swap, and I have a Cast When Channeling Portal Cyclone, so I'm just going to Cyclone a little bit, and it's going to pop a portal, and now we're going to head into the actual boss room. So Phoenix is definitely a bit of an annoying one, because you need to be close enough to where your General Cries are actually going to be hitting the boss, but you don't want to be too close enough to where you'll just die from his attacks. So positioning is really important on this build. So we're just going to put down our debuffs, and then we're going to proc our Berserker, and then we're going to kind of run away while he's charging up, and then kind of come back in when he's no longer doing anything that could, you know, kill us, really. So here comes the second boss, or not.
The sanity of the mind.
Okay, well, I'm not sure exactly what happened there. The second boss decided he just didn't want to show up, so that's a bit of a weird bug. But yeah, that's pretty much you know, what a guardian kill would look like on a really, really small budget. Now, the thing about this build is, like I mentioned at the start of the video, if you're willing to put currency into it, you can scale this damage way higher than any of my other League starters, and by far. So if I put on this right slot, I put on a Paradoxica, I get a +2 Impale Watcher's Eyes, I get like an Abyssus with a buff, I get some good Hands of High Templar, I can get the damage to ridiculous numbers, as I'm about to showcase. So let's go ahead and jump into the POB for this build. So as always, what I've done here, let me just showcase it real quick. I have prepared some leveling trees. So once you hop into the POB, you'll see that there are some different leveling trees. So what we're going to level with is slams. So the thing about slams is that it's definitely not the most noob-friendly way of leveling. It requires quite a few buttons, and it's a bit clunky, but I made sure to really kind of invest everything while leveling into the feels goodness of the build. So for example, by the time that you swap to slams, which would be around Dominus, or actually after you do labs, so in Crystal Veins, this is all going to be in the notes, I'll talk about that in a second. You are going to have a bunch of Warcry speed, as well as Warcries cannot exert travel skills, which means that you can now start leap slamming, something that you couldn't do before. And I got some onslaught effects, so the build should feel really good in terms of both attack speed and move speed. By the time you hit Kitava, you're going to have some more nodes related to your Warcry, so that should feel even better, and some resistances through Diamond Skin, so gearing should be really easy. This is kind of going to be what's replacing the typical going of a Lyra, because on this build we're going to go with 2 passives. By the time you get to Blood Aqueducts, we are getting Onslaught right here, down here, which allows us to drop Onslaught on our links. You'll see that in the notes section. And we're getting some good old Fortify action, as well as some more Warcry nodes. So this build should feel quite smooth even during the leveling. And the reason why I did the build like that is I wanted to try to minimize the amount of respec points you are going to take. By the time you're around mid-level 70s, you should be around the point where you can afford to respec by, you know, getting the shield. It's the only real mandatory option. So even just doing Chaos Recipe, by the time that you're mid-level 70s, you should be ready to go and buy the shield. So this is kind of where the POB ends at level 77. Essentially, at that point, we've got Resolute Technique, and we've got all of the nodes for mana reservation efficiency, so that we can run Determination as well as all the other auras. Again, I'll talk about that in a second. And then we are going to swap into General Cry whenever we get the shield and whatnot, and this is kind of the General Cry tree. We are focusing heavily into damage. If you want a little bit of extra survivability, and your damage feels really, really good, you could actually drop these nodes up here, and instead you could go down here and, you know, grab Determination has 25% efficiency, and then also grab Champion of the Cause alongside 15% mana reservation efficiency. So you would be giving up 4 nodes worth of damage, or 5 nodes, in order to get some mana reservation efficiency that will allow you to run Determination. So that is definitely an option that you could go with. Otherwise, there's not too much you could do on this tree, because realistically, you could just grab a bunch of life if you really wanted to go down that route, which is definitely an option if you don't have the clusters. Because the level 90 tree, what we are doing essentially is we're keeping the exact same tree, but we're going to invest into some cluster jewels. So we have a physical cluster here. Again, you're just going to use jagged fossils in order to get the large cluster. Extremely easy to roll this. It's on average 20 jagged fossils to get any 3 notables on a physical cluster, so very easy to do. And none of them have any item level requirements. So even like a level 5 cluster jewel, if that even existed, would work. We're going to round up the build with Haunting Shout and Led by Example, and this is a medium cluster. This is another one that is extremely easy to roll. You're just going to use alterations and then regals, so alteration for Haunting, regal for Led by Example, or vice versa until you get both, and that's pretty much your end game cluster right there. Now, Mob Mentality is what you would go for before, but now we actually have Sword Mastery, which gives us Frenzy Charges when you hit a unique enemy, and this is really, really nice because it allows us to get permanent uptime on our Frenzy Charges even when we are dealing with single target. That does mean, however, that we are going to be losing Power Charges, which is kind of a big deal for this build, but it's also not at the same time because we are not scaling a whole lot of crit in the first place. So this allows us to cut the Mob Mentality, which was kind of like the expensive cluster out of the build. I'll showcase the expensive version. I have another POB for the more expensive version of the build. So in its current state, the build is doing about 9.5 million DPS, but this is counting 11.3 attacks per second. So the way that this works is that it only scales up to 10%. So the way that you would actually figure out the damage that you would do 9,569,850 divided by 11.31 and then times 10, and this would be your actual damage that you are doing, so around 8.4 million DPS on an Ichimonji. Again, we are talking about really budget gear. The only thing here is a ring with the Assassin's Mark, as I was mentioning. This does have Raislata. If you take out Raislata, you're looking at 7.5 million DPS, and this is not fluffed or anything like that. If you look at the config, this is perfectly fair. You have 70 rage, and I only put 50 because that's a pretty good average of how much rage you would truly have, despite the fact that we are running Berserking and, of course, Crave the Slaughter for an extra 10 rage, so that means that we have 70 rage. Now, with 70 rage, our damage would go up by a lot, but again, I want to be realistic when I make my POBs, so I'm rocking about 50 rage. So 7.5 million damage until you get the Raislata. That pushes you up to 9.5 million damage, and that is still, you know, a pretty budget POB. Now, what I want to talk about before I talk about the more endgame POB is how to level this build, because it's definitely a bit of a weird one. So if you look in the notes, everything that you need to know about leveling this build is in there. I did not skip anything. So for example, you will want to league start as a duelist, get to, you know, kill Hillock, get yourself a splitting steel, and then you're going to put everything in your stash and make a new character, which is going to be your actual Marauder character. It's very important that you pick up all rustic sashes. There's a rustic sash recipe for physical damage on your weapons. This is the order of the weapons that you actually care about until a Kurui Chopper, which is your endgame option at level 58. But at that point, you're basically just going to run a Kurui Chopper all the way up until you swap to General Cry, at which point you're going to be also resetting your tree, or respecking your tree. The respec is not too bad. If you look at the level 77 build, it looks like this, and then the level 90 General Cry looks like that. So the vast majority of the stuff pretty much stays the exact same. There is some pretty minimal respec, so you shouldn't really need too many regrets outside of the ones that you get from your regular quests, maybe just a few. You should have them by that time anyways. So again, you'll have all of the links as well as the setups and where you get the gems and when you get the gems in order to make the leveling extremely smooth. And we are going to be swapping into a Slammer build because initially we're going to run Spectral Helix after our first lab. And the reason for that is because that is when we are going to get Warbringer. And that is also around the time where we are going to get a Admonisher, which is going to give us a bunch of Warcry speed, which is going to make actual slamming feel good. Before that, slamming just doesn't really feel good because you are definitely lacking the Warcry speed. It's extremely important on a Warcry build. Okay, and then you've got, again, all of the links and all that good stuff. At level 34, what's going to be very important is that you get yourself Berserk because that is pretty much going to be mandatory. Otherwise, there's no reason to even use Warbringer. What's really cool is that you also are going to be getting Warcry Mastery, which gives you Warcries have a minimum of 10 power. So what the node does here, Warbringer gives you 10 rage per 5 power. So that means that no matter what you are Warcrying to, you are going to be getting 20 rage whenever you Warcry once you have this Warcry Mastery, which is really, really nice until, of course, you know, later on when you get Red Blade Banner, we're going to be dropping that node because it's going to be useless. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Otherwise, at level 38, there's some little bit of gem swaps, nothing crazy. And then around level 70 to 75, around the time where you're ending your actual play as a slammer, and you can keep playing as a slammer if you're enjoying the playstyle and your damage is good or you don't have the currency or whatever it is. You can keep going with this tree by just simply grabbing more life and stuff like that. But around that time, we were going to be investing pretty heavily into mana reservation efficiency, around somewhere in the late level 60s, early level 70s. So that is kind of when we are going to be able to start running auras. And the cool thing about the changes to mana reservation efficiency and the ability to get a decent amount of them is that we were able to run Dread Banner, Blood and Stand, Determination, Herald of Purity, and Flesh and Stone, and still have about 10% mana left over, which means that in terms of the build, even with that many auras, the build should still feel pretty good. So that's pretty much it in terms of the budget setup. Now, I know I've mentioned a few times that this build can get some pretty disgusting numbers when we were talking about some medium and high level of investment. So again, I've made another Warcry POB, General Cry POB, that will also be linked in the description. And this one is kind of where we're going into a little bit more juice, if you want to call it that. So we are going from 90 to 95. And at that point, look at our damage. We were rocking 9 million damage before. Now we are rocking a solid 41 million damage. And the thing is, you see some POBs around sometimes that have like something 200 million damage. And you're like, wow, that's like 40 million. That's not a lot of damage, Matt. What's going on here? Only 40 million. Well, this is a 40 million true damage. This is not fluffed up damage. This is like, I will sit on top of Maven for 1.5 seconds and she will die. This is like, I will kill the entirety of the feared encounter in roughly 25 seconds, right? This is what 41 million damage actually looks like. A lot of POBs that you see around with, some hundreds of millions of damage, I'm not going to lie, are just fluffed up DPS. And the reality is, you walk up to Maven, and this does a lot more damage than those POBs. And here's the cool thing about this POB. It's not even that expensive, right? Yes, you have a Paradoxica. Yes, you're getting attack speed and fizz, which is really nice. Red Blade Banners are a go-to. Abyss is still our go-to. But we're still not getting some double crazy influenced item, right? I don't have like a base crit chest alongside some crazy good mods. Like, for example, minus mana costs, elevated attack crit, elevated res, and +1 curse, or anything like that. I'm going with some pretty cheap stuff. I've got a pair of gloves here with attack speed and attack crit. So again, not too crazy. You could go all out and get some vulnerability on hit and then get +1 on your chest. You could also, for example, get +1 frenzy on there. That would be a decent chunk of damage. The boots are just tailwind, nothing else, and just a bit of move speed, bit of res, life. You could go Tailwind Elusive and go all out on the boots. They're still not that crazy. High-Risk Truth is pretty much your endgame amulet until we're talking about some extremely endgame options. So that's a really good thing there. The ring is the exact one that I have in my character in the actual game currently, as you saw earlier. So very, very, pretty basic ring, just Assassin's Mark on hit. The other ring, Life and Res. A Res Sloth is still the way to go. And then the only real other expensive thing in there is the Impale +2 Watcher's Eye, which is giving us, to be fair, a big chunk of damage, 15% damage from that. And then Paradoxica is the other kind of expensive option alongside Hands of the High Templar. But this 40 million damage is not a build that you're going to have to invest, 300x into. This entire build would probably cost you somewhere around 20-25x, which for a little bit more of an advanced player, that is a pretty easy day 2, day 3 build, and then you are farming the feared with your eyes closed, because this level of damage is pretty ridiculous. Again, I'm not running some crazy, level 21, 23 gems. I don't even have a single Awakened Gems in there, and God knows that they have buffed Awakened Gems pretty heavily. A lot of the gems that are awakened are getting like +1 levels and a lot of additional attack speed, Intimidate, stuff like that. Some pretty cool stuff that is coming on with the buffs to those. But that's pretty much what we're looking like. In terms of defenses, rocking about 5k life, right about 25,000 armor. So that should keep you alive, unless you're really just face tanking everything. Now this is level 95. You could easily just say, again, you could give up a little bit of damage and go for some additional maximum resistances if you wanted to go down that route. It's definitely something that you could do, +2 max res, and this also would allow you to, for example, get immunity to corrupted blood or even some chaos resistance. But because there's one thing that this build doesn't have right now, and that is chaos resistance. But the thing is, you have to remember that positioning is extremely important on this build. So yes, Chigil is a problem, for example, for the feared, or even when farming, for example, pure Chigil or Breachstones, but it's only a problem if your positioning is bad. If your positioning is actually good, you are not going to have any issues because you never have to be within melee range, and the reason for that is because we're investing a decent chunk into, some nice little area of effect. Things like, Pulverize helps a lot with that. I see a lot of General Cry POBs with Conk Effect because, yes, it boosts your damage up to ridiculous amounts, But then the thing is, you're never actually hitting with General Cry unless you're directly on top of a monster, right? It's also the reason why, I think I need to talk about that real quick, the reason why I go with Rite of Ruin, and a lot of POBs that you will see as Berserker General Cry go with Blitz charges. The thing about Blitz charges is that they're a huge bait. Not only do they completely kill your critical strike chance, which is not the end of the world on this build due to the fact that we are hitting so much and for so much, but the reason why this is really big debate, in my opinion, is that yes, it gives you a ton of attack speed, so it's really easy to hit that threshold of 10 attacks per second where your General Cries are releasing at 6 stages, but the downside is that your General Cries do not generate Blitz charges. You generate Blitz charges, which means that if you're cycloning, you have to be directly on top of a mob in order to get those Blitz charges. I think it's a lot better and a lot safer, a lot more consistent to go Crave the Slaughter and Rite of Ruin, in order to just get that triple effect. This also gives you a bunch of movement speed by tripling the effect of your 5 rage. So, for example, if you're at 50 rage, instead of, getting 10 move speed, you're getting 30. That's an extra 20% move speed. It's just you're clearing maps that much faster. So that's pretty much going to be the POBs for my General Cry League Starter. This is one that I'm actually heavily leaning into at the moment because it's one that I know that I can invest currency into and just kind of push it and push it and push it, which is the big problem right now with Seismic Trap and Eye of Winter and even my Reap Miner that I'll be making a guide about tonight or on tonight. And that is just, the ceiling is not very high unless you want to get into some cheesy mechanics like Low Life and Righteous Fire. But then you kind of end up giving away so much survivability that the build just kind of starts to feel really clunky. Meanwhile, this is just a solid all-around build. And realistically, when played right, it's not as squishy as it sounds. Anyways, that's going to be it for my guide on my General Cry League Starter. Before I go, I do want to say a huge thank you to my supporters. So Kat, Alex, Brandon, Nate, the second Alex, Flame Scorpion, Neroth, Grimoire, the Great Master, Johnny, Thomas Mass, Reese, Tim, Axel, Road to Millions, Adicus, Scott, Stan, Zarashi, Welcome Back, and Wolverine, as well as, of course, Ronald, Kevin, the third Alex, Bitizen, and Mercury, anybody else who's supported me in the past, and anybody else who wishes to remain anonymous. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.